everybody, and welcome to Book Banter. I'm Raina Nielsen from Blue Cypress Books, and I am super excited this evening to talk to Addison Armstrong about her book, The Light of Luna Park. It is a debut novel for her, historical fiction that it focuses on two incredibly strong women and this amazing little part of history that I knew almost nothing about before starting to read her book. Luna Park was one of the amusement parks on Coney Island. So we're going to dig deep into this history and this book and share it with you and talk to you all about it. If you have any questions or comments throughout the event, type them into the comment box below and we will answer your questions and respond in real time during the event. So without further ado, I'm going to click this button and welcome Addison to Book Banter. Hi.
Hello, I'm so excited to be here.
Yay, I'm excited that you were able to join me. Truly reading this book I love history and I love reading, so it like covers two of my right.
That's how I felt writing it.
And like a little known part of history. I mean, I've barely ever heard of it. So do you want to give us like the elevator pitch? What's your book about?
Yeah, so like she mentioned, it's dual timeline. And the first timeline is 1926, and it follows a nurse, Althea Anderson. And she ends up actually kidnapping a baby who was born premature and who the hospital is going to let die, and takes it to Coney Island, to the amusement park. Because from 1903 to 1943, a man actually ran an incubator ward there as a sideshow. So you could pay to come in and see these premature babies. And it was really the only place that they were treated at the time. So that first timeline follows Althea and this baby and, the repercussions of that. And then the second timeline is 1950. It follows Stella Wright, who is a newly married teacher. She teaches special ed, though it's not called that at the time, of course. And her mother has just passed away. She's having issues. Her husband has PTSD, also not yet called that, from World War II. And she's just going through a lot of changes at work and in her life. And so she's sort of dealing with all that and unraveling a mystery at the same time.
I love it. I love the setup. You have perfected the no spoilers. And thumbs up. That is the hardest part about this interview series, is when you have finished the book. Where do you imagine? So this piece of first of all, I was not only like amazed that this even occurred, having the pre-incubators on Coney Island, but then it's actually a long period of time. It's like 30-some years.
40. It was 40 years at Coney Island, at Luna Park. And then it was also at Dreamland, which was another Coney Island park, sort of Luna Park's rival, and then also at Atlantic City.
Okay, this was a question, and I haven't looked any of this up, but it is mentioned in your book. So those did not run simultaneously? So did they did they?
So Luna Park ran the whole time. The other two ran during parts of that time. So okay. Luna Park and Dreamland were simultaneous. Luna Park and Atlantic City were simultaneous. They overlapped.
And the fact that all over, I'm assuming the world, is that accurate? I mean, at least America, where, preemies were just, they either lived or didn't live. I mean, that was,
and more often didn't. Mm-hmm.
Right.
There's definitely an American thing. Yeah, if you look back, you get the impression that Europe was a little bit further along. It kind of depended where you were, what resources you had, what kind, but America was just like, they're a lost cause.
Well, that's part of it too. It's like one of it is having the equipment, but then the other one is actually the attitude toward. And
that was a huge point.
So I was born in 1980, and my parents had a baby before me that did not make it. And that's 78. So because of, some of it was this, even then, funding and attitude and things like that. So
I know. I was gonna say that's how I type, Stella's a special education teacher. And so some of those same themes run through, if you look at like the World's Fair and all those places where the incubator babies, they were also often like an exhibit at those types of things, centennials, world fairs, expos. And, right next door would be exhibits on eugenics and about, selective mating and breeding of humans. So at the same time, there was this huge push that, these unworthy babies shouldn't live. All they were going to do was pass on these, weak genes to the next generation. And so, in 1950, I have Stella teaching a population that those same people, 20 years earlier would have also deemed not worthy of life. So that's kind of the thread that connected it, which, was more of the attitude, like you were saying.
And especially more in the beginning when we learn, Stella and who she's teaching, the classroom of kids that she teaches. And you touch on this very, very briefly. Like I don't remember the exact quote or anything. And there's a few sentences about talking about the parents that actually sent their kids to this school and thinking about them. I mean, there's this whole group of people that have to they're going against the grain, and that it took, to make a change, like sometimes, you change a movement, right? Stella is at you can see at the forefront of this idea where she's going to come and kind of try and change the attitude there. But these parents are integral into that too. Like they didn't send their kids away to some institution, or they didn't give up on them in the beginning.
It was parents. It was not medical professionals. It was not teachers, educators. It was parents who spearheaded everything at the beginning. I mean, they were the only reason that education and all this stuff came about before like Kennedy and all of his, government actions. But until then, it was parents, because otherwise they would have been in these institutions. And most of them were, parents had to argue with doctors. Doctors would say, no, you need to send this child to live their days in this crumbling place. And parents would flat out refuse, and doctors did not approve. Like they were not happy with that.
Well, then when you decide to do that, I'm imagining as a parent, then you get home and now what? Like there's no system.
Right. There's nothing. No one's there to support you. There are no resources. Mm-hmm.
You just feel it's the right thing to do. And then you got to figure it out. You're winging it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I was also, both of the women in your story, and actually not kind of all of the women in your story are very strong, but we follow Althea and Stella the closest, obviously. And both of them are just like I feel like the woman we all want to be. That makes sense. Like both of them in these different ways, and they follow these very, kind of different paths. Althea gives up her job and, her life plan as she knows it to take care of this baby, because again, she just feels like it's the right thing to do.
Right.
And I wish that I were that brave in that moment. Like I imagine that I would do the same thing.
That's funny that you say that, because I've definitely had people say like these, what's wrong with her? She's a kidnapper. She's breaking the law. Or I've had people say, Stella's so annoying. She's, too stubborn, too impulsive. And, then we have people on the other side like, wow, I wish I could be more like them.
Right.
So it's just interesting, the different interpretations.
I think the part of it too is we think of women in these time periods. So it's 1925, 26, and 40, 50, 51. We think of women in those time periods as weak, as, the picture that we're always painted is a homemaker, sort of situation. And both of these women are homemakers.
Right.
But there were also plenty of women, let's be real, most women they did so many things. We live our lives today. They live their lives today. These are, I guess Althea's is a little bit more exceptional, but I don't think either one of them are, they're just, standard. They're not the average woman of the time, but I don't know that they're as abnormal as we are led to believe.
Right. I know it's a hard line to walk, when you're writing it, you're like, well, I don't want this to be a 21st century woman just stuck in 1926. I can't have me being there because obviously the attitudes are going to be different and, everything. So it's a fine line to walk, but then you read about people who were incredible rebels at the time. I mean, militant suffragists. And I mean, if those people could exist, certainly these people could.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Also, I love the different time period too in the 1920s where the whole birth certificates and death certificates and the vital statistics are like, I don't know, they didn't really keep great records. Like
Honestly.
now, like it's true though.
And I would find newspaper articles from the times that was like, oops, babies sent home with the wrong parents, brought back 2 weeks later because they realized, like things happened. People have questioned, like, is it really, realistic that Althea could take this baby? And I'm like, unfortunately, yes, it's very realistic if you look at what was going on in the hospitals at the time.
Yeah, and especially like, the nurses, her friend didn't even really question it. She's just like, oh, right. I finished filing your paperwork. It was a death certificate, but like, did you solid? Have a great day,
Yes, exactly. And especially with a baby, because sort of the prevailing attitude, I think now people are allowed to more fully grieve babies that they've lost. But at the time it was, oh, well, you never knew them anyway. What does it matter? Was like the prevailing attitude. So they were like, oh, the parents don't want to see the body. There's not going to be a burial. There's not a memorial. We're going to pretend they never existed was the, reigning attitude. So it was very easy to sort of whisk that baby away and pretend it was
gone. I love too how at the time, and I know this isn't even that far removed, but that the system just did the thing. This is just the way we do it. Like they didn't ask the mom, they don't ask the dad, they're just like, yep, all right, so the baby's gone. We'll just make sure you're okay and sign this paper
and that's that.
Go home. So
yeah,
that was unsettling. Although accurate,
yes,
probably
a lot of it
is. Okay, so we have a question. Okay, so in regard to like your research, I guess, was there something you learned that didn't make it into the book? Like maybe that was about that, but didn't make it.
Yeah. I tried to slip all those like little tidbits in. I couldn't put really much about, so back up. The man who ran the incubator wards was Martin Coney. He was actually born Michael Cohen and in Europe and immigrated to the US when he was about 19, we think. He claimed he had his, doctorate and all of his medical training in Germany and in the UK. It turned out after he died and many years later, they figured out all that was made up. His entire story was invented. He did not have a medical license. He was a con man. He was a con man, but he saved thousands of babies' lives. And that's, what drew me to the story initially or to the setting was just the bizarre juxtaposition of these like orderly hospital wards next to the, hot dog eating contests and roller coasters and freak shows. But what really kept me interested in it was that contradiction and that sort of ethical question. Like he was a liar, he was a con man, but he did the right thing. And that's kind of where I got Althea's debate. She was technically a kidnapper and a liar, but she was doing it for the same reason that he was, to save a baby's life. So I really wish that I could have put more of Cooney's life in there and talked about how he wasn't really a doctor and how he made all this up, but no one knew at the time. So I couldn't put it in there. Even Stella, no one knew it then either. It was later that all that came out. So I think that's something I would have loved to put in. That's the biggest thing that jumps out at me.
Well, that's a big one.
Yeah. It's in the author's note. Like I made sure to squeeze it in there somewhere, but.
Well, then the question is too, like, how did he get this information? Like, he's a con man, but like, he pulled it off.
Right. What it seems is that he did like do an apprenticeship of some sort under a doctor in Germany who was doing premature baby stuff. So he had seen it happen and it was like at an expo. So he was like, I can do this. I can bring it to the World's Fair and then this and that in the United States. And then his nurses were actually very highly trained. So the nurses that I have in the book are all actually real nurses. Louise Recht was the big one there the whole time. And then his wife, Annabelle May, was also one of the nurses. And then his daughter, Hildegard, was also born premature after he started this. Like it wasn't the precipitating event or anything, but she was born premature, and she ended up, when she grew up, she was the one who ran the Atlantic City ward. So his nurses were very highly trained. He was not.
Well, and it's a smart man, right? He
Yes,
knows what he
right. They're the
knows,
ones
and
who
he
knew.
can get in the door. He can run
Yes.
that con and get in the door, but he needs to surround himself. If it doesn't work, if he gets a bunch of babies and then it doesn't work out,
And then he doesn't know what to do with them.
Right.
And he was great with like the publicity. I mean, he would hold graduation ceremonies when they got old enough to leave, and he would have like reunions. They would come back, and he would give them like, graduation certificates and jewelry that had their name in there when they left. Like, he was very big on publicizing it all and marketing it. That was his strength.
Well, and in the book you have this card that I don't know, the incubator ward. What would you call where they are? I don't know.
That's what I call it.
Right? That they send out just, to the parents, just say,
yes,
love you, mommy and daddy.
Yeah, they send updates. They would send, I think, I found information about them sending like Mother's Day cards out from the babies, and Father's Day cards, Valentine's Day, Christmas. I think there was like a Rosh Hashanah one, which is another thing, actually, that at the time, hospitals and things were all still very segregated. And so Cooney was one of the few people that would take not only like, white Protestant babies,
right,
but also Jewish babies and Black babies, and Asian babies, different races and ethnicities and religions. And that in and of itself was unique, much less the setting in which it all occurred.
And I want, we're talking about getting away with it, how he got away with it, because the paper trail of the 20s and the paper trail of today is not the same. But again, he's doing such good work that no one is mad at him. I mean, the people that would turn him in, for example, like, the parents, or something goes wrong, I would be grateful that there's an option.
Right. Yeah, the medical community was very distrustful. They were not fans for the most part, spoke out against him, but he had a couple of allies that helped, keep him afloat. But it's interesting because people just didn't trust him at all. And there was, I can't remember what year, but there was a fire that burned down Luna Park. And all of the babies were rescued, every single one, because there were always people there with them, obviously. But the newspapers reported that they were all dead. And it was an honest mistake, so to speak, because they just had zero faith in this person, and they kind of just expected it. They were like, oh, yeah. They didn't even bother checking. It's just interesting to see like all of the media kind of like slated against him.
It is interesting because, the whole thing is kind of crazy pants. But we wouldn't have like a NICU in every single hospital.
Right. And that's why he stopped when he did, 1903 to 1943, because 1943, and that was when they were starting to put bring the first incubators into mainstream hospitals in New York, or in the Northeast. So it's bizarre. And some of the people, some of them were still alive 5 years ago. They not only survived, but lived to be 90, full long lives, and they wouldn't have. And it's just so bizarre to think, all of their descendants wouldn't be here either if it weren't for that one man.
Right. And all, everything is like the whole idea of, the genetic and eugenics and things, to think now, it's difficult to think now that was mainstream. Not that, especially, like you said, not
especially once World War II had happened, and America was like, we never thought that had nothing to do with us. Whereas, Hitler himself said, America is like a paragon of what we should do. Like they got it right. He based things on the United States, but yeah, now we look back and we're like, that doesn't seem possible.
Right. Yeah. And again, it's one of the many things throughout history that you imagine it's much longer ago than it actually is.
Yes.
And so when you are writing this, and you have these really strong female characters. Are they based at all on either a real person from history, your life, or how did you piece them together?
That's a good question. Not consciously or intentionally. But I definitely, because I've gotten asked this a lot, and I see parts of my sister and Stella, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Like Ryan is she's 3 years younger than me, but she's, loyal to, I mean, she will, she would do anything for the people she loves. She will fight for you till the end. She just, I see a lot of similarities between her and Stella, and I think some of that was subconsciously going on. And then my second novel, which is coming out in August, The War Librarian, Emmeline, my 1918 character, is sort of loose. I wouldn't even say based, because that's too much of a stretch, but semi-inspired by a real librarian, Mary Frances Ism. So there's a little bit, but it's more pulling bits and pieces, and the characters are sort of their own.
Yeah. Of course. You have to say that. It's usually, I feel like it's probably usually true, but everyone's like, not really, but kind of.
Right. My villains aren't based on.
Exactly. So, do you think, based on evidence or just guessing, not to say that somebody kidnapped a baby, but that something similar could be possible?
I don't know that I would say plausible, but I would say possible.
Because someone in the hospital where the baby was born had to be willing to recommend, right? Had to recommend this as an option. So,
yes. And some hospitals did. I mean, for some of them, it was the standard.
Oh, really?
Yes. Like at some points, they even had ambulances at the hospitals that had like the sole purpose of ferrying babies to Coney Island.
That's, yeah. I mean, it seems kind of silly. So how many babies could they hold at one time? Do you know that?
It varied depending on the year. The facilities sort of changed. Sometimes what they would do when they were getting, full, because it was not a huge number, is they would put twins and triplets together in the same incubator. Sometimes just things like that so that they could hold more, but sometimes they did run out of room. There's an interview online with a woman who was an incubator baby at Luna Park. And she said she was born, 5 minutes after another premature baby. And they called Dr. Cooney, and Cooney said he only had one spot. He could only take one of the two babies. So he said, I'm sorry, you're going to have to ask the one who was born first. So they asked the mother of that little boy, and she said, no, I'm not sending my kid to a freak show. And so the second little girl who was born got the spot and lived, 95 years later to give this interview. And that first boy did not survive. So there was, unfortunately, a limit to the resources and things. But that's also where, it seems unrealistic that a parent would say, no, don't save my kid, which is exactly what I have happen in the very beginning of the book. But right. I pulled that from there too. Like they did say that.
Well, and that was like we were talking about, that's the prevailing, notion of the day is more like, okay, right. This happened, get over it. The easiest way to get over it is
how it's supposed to happen. Mm-hmm. And right. Then we don't want to save this baby. This baby's just going to be, defective was a word they used, weaklings,
I was like, in reading your book, I kept waiting for somebody to say like, well, isn't this God's plan? Couldn't this be God's plan? Like right. Us making the machines and having the doctors.
Right. Well, I think Althea does say something like, isn't this, God's modern miracle? Like, this is
right. And I'm like, no. It's like, why? Felt like that would be the easy obvious. Other side of this. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I don't know.
Exactly. I really liked Mrs. Wallace a lot. Wallace, that's correct, right?
Yeah.
She so at one point, for everybody, if you haven't read it, Althea, so in 1925, right, gets 26. Okay. She takes a job as a live-in caretaker for an older woman on Times Square, right? And so she goes in pretty much sight unseen, like she doesn't know the woman or anything, and she does get the job. And so this older woman, and she could have been like the grumpiest character. She could have gone in so many directions, right? But I love the way having a baby in the house, like, first of all, she's into it. She's totally okay with it. And then also, like, you see that the older woman and the baby, and you can see them light up to each other. And I think that was so these moments I could really picture, and they were like these beautiful moments that you included.
Thank you.
I don't know if that was she inspired by somebody that you know, or just like a piece of the puzzle?
Not in particular, but I think there's just, at the time there was no institutional support for women, especially a single mother. And of course she pretended she was married, so it wasn't a big scandal and whatever, but women had to support each other. That was just the way that, or else there was no one to do it for you. So I think that's part of it. And I didn't realize till after the book was published, but I was actually student teaching at the time that I, finished up the edits and everything. And my mentor teacher was actually named Miss Wallace. So I don't know if I subconsciously did that intentionally. If so, it's a great way to honor her because she was amazing. But
that's a great story because, like, you didn't notice. You're like, oh, Mrs. Wallace.
It was Mrs. versus Miss, so totally separate.
Yeah, completely different person. Mm-hmm. As happens in this book, you go from Mrs. to Miss to when you're like, totally different. Clearly not. Yeah. The implications of those simple words, nurse, miss, Mrs., all of that tells a story and no one needs to ask you other questions.
Right.
And I'm like,
well, my editors had to catch me a couple times. I kept using Ms. in 1950 and they were like, this was not a word. And I'm just so used to it. That's what I've always put on my own things. That's how I address things. I was like, oh, you're right. It wasn't. It was one of the things I slipped up on the most commonly. And it's just so interesting because, there's a reason it wasn't a word yet. Like it tells a story.
Right. And for Stella, she is a professional. She could easily be a Ms. without anybody really questioning it. Okay, so another thing that I noticed a lot in your book, which I actually kind of loved, is this is going to sound silly. They use the telephone. Now, stay with me. Okay. Right? Because we pull our phones out of our pockets, and so much in TVs and movies and even books, you don't touch it unless you absolutely need it because it's too easy, right? If something is set in modern time. And they would pick up the phone and call each other. And I was like, this is so adorable. Now it's time period fitting and it's great. And you do an amazing job. But I was like, oh my gosh, she's on the phone and she has to hurry and hang it up because she thinks she hears footsteps at one point. And I'm like, I love this.
Right. It's just like even the little details are just so different when you go back 50, 70, 100 years. Just everything, the fabric of day-to-day life.
So what do you enjoy about writing historical fiction as opposed to more contemporary fiction?
I love the research. The research might be my favorite part. Also, when I'm stuck, I can, kind of pretend I need to research and go down these research rabbit holes that are really just procrastination. But I love the research. They were always my favorite to read. So it kind of just seemed natural. And then I don't know. I love about history that, we learn it in school and it's very this happened. Mm-hmm. But it's just crazy to think that every tiny decision that some random human made could have impacted your entire life. And so I love especially dual timeline or multiple timeline stories because, they kind of give you a way to see the way that those repercussions, echo throughout generations. So that's one of the things I just love about it is getting to see, okay, she does this. What's that going to do 20 years down the road? Mm-hmm. But just I have to keep myself from adding in all these irrelevant details that would just bog it down because I just love researching everything.
And writing the fiction lets you kind of fill the pieces in between like the things like you're talking about, the things we learn typically in history class or whatever. It's dates, it's places.
And then to make it personal and to make you see, wow, that could have been me, if I were born then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that's fascinating. And also one of the things that I enjoy about reading historical fiction as well is that you do learn things, first of all, like your research, what you put in this book then makes me want to go, wait a minute, and figure out, which bits are real and which bits aren't. And then also like just going, like you said, these rabbit holes, like this is a fascinating piece of history. And I was telling you actually before we went live that just a couple of weeks before you contacted us about maybe having an event of some kind, my son was like, hey, do you want to watch this YouTube video documentary? And I'm like, yes, because you're my teenage son and you never want to do anything with me. And it happened to be about Coney Island, which I didn't know much about. And they barely, like maybe a minute or so, touched on these incubator babies. And I remember after it was over thinking, okay, which bits really stuck out at me? And that one did. And I planned to go research it, just didn't. And then your email came in and I was like, yes, oh my gosh, Luna Park, I recognize that. I have to read this. Now I'm like down. I'm like, this is all, like this fate came together for those two things. And now it's just fascinating bit of history.
Yeah, and I stumbled across it so randomly too. It was just an article online. It popped up and it had one of those like super clickbaity titles. It was like, con man saves thousands of babies. It just didn't sound real, but I couldn't help it. I clicked on it and I read that article and then I ended up looking it up and finding that it was real. And I was just, like I said before, just so fascinated by the just bizarreness of this incubator ward, which was by all accounts like impeccably clean. I mean, cleaner than a lot of hospitals at the time, very orderly, very quiet. The guests or the, I guess, tourists, whatever, had to follow rules, wash their hands, keep their voices down. And then outside there's all this craziness going on. And so that, like I said, drew me in. And then it was I read 2 books, like literally that night that I found out about it. I was so fascinated. I downloaded both of the like nonfiction books I could find about it, read them both. And that's where I learned about Cooney's, con manness and his lies. And then I was like, that's it. This is what I have to write about this. And I mean, I remember talking to my mom on the phone and, my sister, and I was like, I read the craziest thing. And there are these incubators, and they're like, oh yeah, that's weird. I'm like, no. I don't think you understand. It's like weird. I'm like, yeah, it's super weird. So anyway, I'm like, no. That's all I want to talk about for the rest of my life. So to keep from boring everyone around me to death with it. But
that's hilarious. I can't. How are they bored? How do they not want to go like Google this themselves? I don't know.
I know. I was like, listen.
That's fascinating. I don't know. So the War Librarian, and I haven't seen it really, read it. Is there another like little known piece of history that started that one?
Yes, I would say not quite as bizarre, but yes. So I don't even remember how I stumbled across this one, but during World War I, the American Library Association and the War Department partnered up to send books overseas. And it was this huge, huge push. I mean, little kids were doing like fundraisers in their neighborhoods to send books overseas. And it was, I mean, a massive undertaking in terms of resources and people and money and all of that. And I could find just a little bit about librarians that actually would staff these huts, mostly here in the States, excuse me, at military bases, training camps, but a few overseas in France, especially after the war in 1919, when there was still a lot of convalescence in France. And that was just so fascinating to me because A, books, and because B, we hear, typically when we hear female stories during World War I and World War II, or at least World War I, it's the stories of nurses. And of course, that's incredible. I mean, Althea's a nurse. Like, obviously, I find that fascinating and so important. But I had never heard that there would have been librarians serving as part of the War Department. So that's my first timeline is Emmeline. It's 1918. She works at the Dead Letter Office in DC. She's very, bookish. Obviously, she works at the dead letter office. She doesn't have an exciting social life. And she ends up, after a letter with a name from her past, lands on her desk, and she's not supposed to read it, but she does. And it's maybe the first time she's ever broken the rules. And it sets off a chain of events where she actually ends up in France as one of those war librarians. And so that's our first timeline. And then 1976 is Kathleen. She is part of the first co-ed class of women at the Naval Academy. So that's not, little known in that, you could ask anyone and they would know it happened, but I've never read anything about it. I couldn't have told you the date, anything. So it's sort of two semi little known pieces of history that were both just really fun to research.
So that, first of all, World War One, 2 thumbs up. Thank you for writing a book set in World War One instead of World War II, because there are plenty of those. And as fascinating as it is, I could point at 20 on the shelf. You know what I mean? At any bookstore, like you go in, if you want women, you want men, you want full on war, you want, some from home
thriller,
story,
mystery, romance.
Right, got you. So World War One is that is much more fascinating to me, because I feel like I'm not an expert at all, but like I've heard of World War II. So World War One is that's very interesting, and I had no idea there were war librarians.
Yeah, right. And I mean, there's not a whole lot of information. Most of them were there in 1919. Not all of them were women. It was predominantly men, actually, which is another funny thing, because I don't know, today I feel like we think of librarians as women first, as a stereotype. Most of them were at those camps, but to up the stakes, I had to put Emmeline in France. So it's like I said, she's loosely based. There was a woman named Mary Francis who was a Portland, Oregon librarian and went over to France in the very last months of the war to sort of train other librarians. And then a lot of them were YMCA and Red Cross volunteers who were already there working in like the recreation huts, who took on like the additional role of librarian. But it's so fascinating. I mean, there are pictures of the men reading their books in the trenches. There are testimonies of men who talked about how a book quite literally saved their lives because it caught a bullet for them, in front of their face. And then many, many more of men who it, metaphorically saved their lives because it was the only way they could escape from this horrible, horrible reality.
That is absolutely fascinating.
I know. I was just, what really grabbed me about it, at first it was like, wow, that's so interesting. I've never heard of that. But at the same time that there was this massive government push to get those books overseas, the government also published a list of books that the men were not allowed to read.
Oh.
Yes. Okay. So, there was like major censorship, and most of the books were like either German, nationalist books or communist books, though Russia was not with Germany, so I don't know. But some of them were even pacifist books, or books about World War One that had been written earlier in the war that the men were not allowed to read because it might turn them against the war.
Right. I could see that, but
they're already in the war. Like if that didn't turn them against it, I don't know what would. But so that
I can't see somebody like sitting in the trenches, like you're saying, and they're like, it's cool. Wait a minute.
Exactly. That happens. They got it. They know.
Yeah.
But it was just so interesting because like those two things at first didn't seem to jive together. Like they're pushing these books and they're also banning these books. But then I realized, they're both they come from the same place, which is that books have so much power. And that's exactly why they needed these soldiers to have access to them, but also why they had to be very careful about what books they gave them. Because, they were counting on these men to sacrifice their lives. And,
didn't want to introduce anything that might make them like waver on that.
Right. So Emmeline ends up doing sort of a book club with some of the soldiers, and maybe some of that, all comes into play.
Right. Well, and what's, of course, this happens all the time, but we, the same type of thing happens. It's like books are really powerful. Like you sit with a book for days, hours, and really internalizing it. So, that's why you read a fiction novel and fall in love with the character. They stay with you forever and ever. It's not a real person, but it
might as well be.
Right, exactly. It's real to you and to the people who, all the people who read it. So, there's something, I get that, but it's just like, don't. Just stop.
Yeah.
Stop doing that. So also I wanted to ask you personally, because I loved this book and I can't wait to get my hands on the War Librarian. But what are some other historical fiction books or authors that you enjoyed, or maybe you read leading up to writing these books or something?
I think some of the first, dual timeline books that I read were Fiona Davis's books. And I haven't read her newest one yet, but of course, Lines of Fifth Avenue is all about a library. And, her others, The Masterpiece and The Address, those are all great. Kate Quinn is definitely a favorite. I love The Huntress. And then Ariel Lawhon, who wrote Codename Helene and I Was Anastasia. He's great. And I actually was so lucky because I'm in Nashville, or I live in Nashville. So my launch event was with Parnassus Books. It was virtual because of COVID, but it was Ariel who moderated it because she lives in Nashville as well. So I was like, I don't want to talk about my book. I just want to talk about you. So I would definitely recommend those three. Those are the first that come to mind. I love, this is just like one specific book, but by Ta-Nehisi Coates, The Water Dancer.
I haven't read that yet. Yeah, it's in my TBR. It's been there.
Loved it. It was one of my favorite books of whatever year it was, 2019. I don't even know anymore. It all blurs together. But I loved that book.
So I do have to read that one. The Lines of Fifth Avenue, actually, the book club I belong to is talking about that in, May. So it's on my, for real TBR. I got to get to that.
Urgent.
Yeah. And I'm so looking forward to it because I've never read her stuff. And it's just one of those ones, I just haven't gotten to it. And that's one of my favorite thing about book clubs is that they're like, okay, we'll put this one at the top. This is the one now. You have to, I've read so many books that whether I love them or like them, you don't always love the book, but I never would have read it. And you get something out of everything.
No matter what it is.
No matter what.
And that was an interesting one because they live, the librarian of the New York Public Library lives there in the library, which I had no idea that was the case before I read it. It was just so fascinating.
I didn't know that either. When I learned that was actually near the beginning of COVID, because there was some article and it was talking about, everything being shut down and that you couldn't go in. There was nothing happening except there's a couple of people who live in the New York Public Library. And I
didn't realize they still did.
Yeah, evidently. I don't know.
Sign me up.
Google this because it was almost 2 years ago that I read this article, right? And I didn't go do a bunch of my own research. But I was like, okay, I did not know that was a thing at all.
You live in the New York Public Library?
Right. Sign me up. How do we do that? That's what I want to do. I want to do overnights in the library. You know how they were doing them in museums for a while? There's a few big fancy libraries in the country and in the world. That's what I want to do. I will pay you $60. I want to sleep overnight in the library.
I'll join you.
So one of my favorites too is Greer McAllister. Have you read any of her stuff?
I have not. No.
It's not. I haven't read all of hers, but they're not dual timelines. But they do have very strong female characters, and again, it's what the woman that was the first Pinkerton agent. Go. That's the setup for, and and there's a crime and then whatever, and she has to do all the mystery and stuff. But that's
great.
One of the things, and then you follow her, and so I really do. I like her stuff too. I like seeing women in situations where we don't think that that's typically outside our like stereotypical picture of a woman during that time frame, and then researching and learning the truth. Like that's real. A nonfiction book that I read was The Secret Life of Home Economics, The Secret History of Home Economics. Have you read that? You should.
Haven't heard of it.
It's nonfiction, and it is mostly women's history because it's how women got into science, how they got a lot into more of the medical field, how they got into all this because no one would let them in. And they're like, if we could figure out how to do the laundry and do this better, then you guys could make more money with your washing machine or with your soap detergent or with your whatever. That's like went into the rooms and convinced them. And that got them in the door. That allowed them, they're like, well, I'm going to need a degree. I need to learn about this thing.
Right.
So there's all these like women with science degrees that were teaching, working at a company trying to figure out the best way to do laundry detergent, but really that allowed them to do the science they wanted to do on the side.
Right. That's incredible.
Fascinating. So
yeah, I haven't read that.
Anyway.
Add it to the ever-growing list.
Exactly. Well, everybody, I can see you watching, even though you're not commenting. You follow the links in the comments and grab a copy of The Light of Luna Park. We will have some signed at the bookstore.
Yes, I'll be there tomorrow.
Pre-order The War Librarian, which I also have in the comments. It comes out in August, and we might be able to get some signed book plates or something for that.
Absolutely.
Addison, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Oh, thank you. I had lots of fun.
I really appreciate it. All right, bye, everybody.